Hi, Misha here, and we're almost through 2021. We've almost made it, just like crossed the finish line. I don't think this is a year many of us will be sad to see go. It hasn't all been bad, but one thing I'll say about it, it has not been peaceful. And this is the last in the kind of Patreon awareness blitz videos, and we're going to focus on a question as old as time: why not AR15 versus AK47, or rather AR15 versus AKM and AK74. Going to kind of look at different eras and periods from the 60s through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. See who's better and when, because it may change. You know, one might be better in the 60s, one might be better in the 90s, that kind of thing. And of course, better is terribly subjective. I did put out a video comparing the original milled receiver AK-47, i.e. the AK Type 3, to the M14, which I feel is a more apt comparison. If you're going to compare the AR, you need to compare it to the AKM, because frankly, they came out within just a couple of years of each other. For that matter, the M16A1 and the AK74 came out pretty darn close together too. A little further apart, but still. So we're going to kind of crawl through. But one last time, I'll remind you that just trying to raise awareness, trying to get a little more going on as we lead into 2022. Hopefully be able to fund some new things. Do want to try to work on putting together a new shooting range, so that's going to require quite a bit, and hopefully do some traveling. If you can, head over to Patreon. There's a link in the description if you'd like to support, and if you can't, I completely understand. Honestly, just sharing, subscribing, commenting, it does a hell of a lot to help and is much appreciated. So whatever you can do is all I ask, basically. And I've been trying to get back and talk about things. So these aren't all the guns that are going to be in the video, but it's a good sampling from old to new. And with that, let's go back to a time when Elvis was king and Kalashnikov was still alive. It's a bit ironic and quite interesting from a historical standpoint that these really started off at the same time. Like I said, we're going to talk about the AKM because it's the analogous one to the early M16s, Colt 601s from Armorlight. Of course, this is my SB1 and this is my Russian build. You've seen them before. But first, let's talk about the cartridges they fire, because that's really where they're different. The AK, of course, fires 7.62 by 39. Even though it's called M43, the cartridge we know and love today really wasn't perfected until 1946. Before that, it was 7.62 by 41. Whereas the M16, its cartridge started off in the mid-50s and was a development of 222 Remington, and work was primarily done by Winchester. The AK's cartridge is pretty much for being a medium, intermediate cartridge. It was developed with input using the M1 Carbines, 7.62 by 33, and the 7.92 33 Kurs from Germany. They looked at these and kind of upscaled it to be less of a machine gun or PDW cartridge and more of a intermediate cartridge meant for mass volley infantry fire. And research was already showing, even during World War II, that number of rounds in the air mattered more than aimed shots. And so if they were just spraying and praying, as long as they were pointing in the general direction, if you have a bunch of infantry pointing there, that will do the effective suppression job. Also, that engagements were taking place at 300 yards, even 100 yards or less. That's why the cartridge and the gun was not designed really to work past 400 or 500 yards. Not saying it can't be, just that that's the design spec. Now the M16, the 223 cartridges as it would become known, well, reports and studies done in America in the late 40s and 50s pretty much showed the same thing, that number of rounds being fired mattered more than individual aim shots, and that combat was taking place at just a couple of 100 yards or less. And this really kind of pushed this forward. Of course, you had first Melvin Johnson. Got to give that man credit. What an American. What a great story. If you don't know the Melvin Johnson story, click off here now and go read up on him. It's great. He joined Armalite first, and he actually introduced the rotating bolt system, the 7-lug system, to the M16. He'd successfully used it in his light machine gun and infantry rifle in World War II. Stoner would actually come a couple of years later, and he would bring the direct impingement gas system, or if you prefer, the internal piston gas system. Same basic thing. Of course, this would first be tried out on the AR-10 with, of course, George Sullivan kind of helping and overseeing everything, and the AR-10 didn't go anywhere, but they liked where they were going. They saw the lightweight, kind of modern, synthetic construction of the gun, kind of using a lot of technology from Fairchild, who owned Armalite at the time. And they suggested maybe scaling it down to be more of a PDW type gun. And that's where the AR-15 comes to play. 1957, work began and testing began in 1958. As for the AKM, over in Russia, the AK-47 with a machined receiver, it had been put into production in 1949, although it wasn't until about 1952 that they really had it down pat. But the mill gun, it was heavy, it wasn't especially controllable in full auto, and it was relatively resource intensive to mass produce, at least on the scale that Russia and its client states wanted. So already by 1954-55, they knew that they wanted something more reliable and easier to produce, lighter weight, more controllable on fully automatic, cheaper, and cheaper. And there was competitions being held between 56 and 58, and you had Tula and Izhevsk submitting various designs, and Korev would submit some as well, and Kalashnikov would lead a team. And in some ways, this was a return to the original Type 1 with the stamped receiver concept, but this stamped receiver is a much more modern concept versus the one in the AK Type 1. Russia would end up selecting what would become known as the AKM because it was familiar. It was better, but it was a familiar manual of arms. The factories wouldn't have to be retooled, but it was truly a new gun. Almost everything on this gun is changed from the AK-47. New type of furniture. They made a more straight buttstock, held on with a top tang. This was done for both manufacturing and ergonomics. They went to a synthetic pistol grip vis-a-vis wood. They added palm swells to the handguards for better gripping and full auto. They also went to a new pattern of magazine, still made of stamped steel, but thinner, but they put ribs in it to make it as strong. They also went away from using a blued finish to more of a paint over park style. They gave lightning cuts to the bolt carrier and bolt. Again, they have the stamped receiver, which is always a lot lighter. Still have a machined front trunnion. And we have a thinner ribbed top cover. And we have a thinner barrel, saving weight. And actually, this little muzzle device helps a lot in full auto fire. Not really noticeable in semi-auto. It even takes a different bayonet. So lots of little differences that add up to a big different gun. In fact, this is about 1 kilogram lighter than the AK-47. And only, a little bit longer because of the muzzle device and the stock. We're just under 35 inches. Gives you the idea. So these were put into production both at Izhevsk and Tula, officially in 1959, although it would be 1960-61 when they were first really starting to be issued, and it wouldn't be to the mid-60s that they started to really get out and touch someone. So what about the the M16 here. Well, Armorlight wasn't successful with it, and it ended up being sold to Colt in 1959, who quickly revamped it just a little bit and put it into production, put it in their catalog as the Colt 601. And this already made waves amongst some who were not happy with the M14. For more on the M14, see my previous video comparing the AK-47 and the M14. Spoiler, the AK is better. Anyway, the first ones really were tried out in the field in 1961, Project Agile. The Air Force was interested. The Army wasn't so sure, but eventually they would order some as well. Yada yada, let's get forward. Otherwise, this is going to be an 8-hour video. Lots of politicking was involved. The M14 was canceled in 1963. The Colt 602 would go from a 1 in 14 twist rate down to 1 in 12 for stabilization purposes, and that would be without the forward assist. Now the 603 would be the first version with the forward assist. This was made for the Army, also known as the XM16E1, and also used by the Marines. They would initially order several tens of thousands and would first see combat in Vietnam. This gun was designed to be very light, and it is. Your AKM here, depending on the variant, but let's just say Woodstock, whatever, is between 7¼ and 7½ pounds. Quite a bit lighter than the original, but still not as light as the AR15. Depending on the furniture and what else is going on, this thing is 6½ to 7 pounds. Overall length of this gun is about 39 inches compared to just under 35 inches here, so the AK is shorter. That's because it has a 16¼ inch barrel. This one has a 20-inch barrel. Of course, it has originally an open prong flash hider, standard bayonet lug, very lightweight profile barrel, synthetic handguards, synthetic pistol grip, no storage compartment for a cleaning kit in the buttstock, and so on and so forth. Of course, as we know, the early M16s had troubles in the field, but a lot of this wasn't necessarily the gun's fault, but there were teething troubles. But in the M16's defense, it was rushed right into the field. Whereas most guns, the M14 included, and the AK, had time to mature in peacetime testing. So, that's how they both were in the field by the 1960s, and these are pretty much the earliest versions. Of course, this is a 70s production kit, but aside from differences, the features are the same. How do they kind of stack up, feature-wise, ergonomics, and all that good stuff? Comparing rifle to rifle here, this has a muzzle brake. The AR has a flash hider, not really a muzzle brake, but then again, this is a much lighter recoiling round. Magazine, steel, 30 rounds. For the first several years, the AR had alloy, 20 rounds. These were basically meant to be disposable, although in the event they were reused several times. Still, meant to be disposable. The 30 rounder would come much later. The benefit of these mags, you could carry several. Between the lighter ammo and the lighter mag, it really didn't bulk you down. With these, the ammo and the mags are heavier, but I will say that the magazines are more reliable, at least early days. On the other hand, these are rock and lock. Not a bad deal if you're accustomed to it, but these are drop-free with an easy-to-hit mag release, although this early version here doesn't have any protector, so it can be accidentally dumped. And the M16, of course, features a last round bolt hold open with a release. The AK has no such bit critter. So in terms of magazine, the AR is better, except maybe when it comes to reliability and capacity. Now the cartridges, again, 7.62x39 is a great all-around cartridge, but 223 is a great anti-personnel cartridge. It does have a little more range, it is a little more accurate, but of course it doesn't have the kind of penetration. So if you're trying to pick off individual soldiers, maybe better. And of course it's more controllable in full auto, whereas this is better for just kind of light armored vehicles, lightly armored fortifications, but it's a relatively low velocity round. So, which is better? Well, it kind of just depends on your need. I'd say it's a general purpose cartridge, the AK, but the 223 does a lot of things really well. So, not really going to knock it there, frankly. In terms of sights, well, the AK front post, adjustable, rear ladder, elevation adjustable, relative small notch. Original AR style, you have a windage adjustable with 2 flip peep apertures here. Carry handle kind of works as a sighting trough, and you have an elevation adjustable front. You have a longer sight radius, finer sights. The AR has better sights, at least for precision shooting. Hard to say otherwise. They both do have ejection port covers. This one, of course, the standard AR, you know. The AK's is actually its safety. So when it's up, it keeps crud from getting in there. When it's down, ready to go, not so much. In terms of the trigger, they're both military triggers, but I think everyone would agree the AR trigger is generally better. And at this time, the AR is still full auto, semi-auto, select fire. What else? Charging handle. Well, the AR's is in the famous place. Not the most ergonomic, but then again, with the last round hold open and release, you shouldn't be using it too frequently. This may be a controversial opinion, but I actually think the AK's charging handle is better. It can work as a forward assist, it can work as an extraction. It's simple, fixed to the bolt, durable. Yes, it does reciprocate, but if you train not to whack yourself with it, it's fine. It's fine. Yes, this does not reciprocate and is more elegant. Also, you have to punch yourself in the nose with it if you're in certain positions. Here's what I was saying about the safety, just in case you've never thought about it. See, it covers up the action, pretty well sealed. Comes up into the lip here. So, for the magazine, I give it to the AR. For the charging handle, personally, I like the AKs better. And people don't seem to mind the reciprocating charging handle on the M14, now do they? As far as the safety itself, now there, the AR is better. It's conveniently placed on the thumb, selector, switch, and safety together. Positive clicky detents. It's separated enough you're not going to accidentally throw it. The AKs is over here. It's fine, but you know, you have all 3 positions right up together. There would be down, you know, middle, and then up. Yeah, a little more fidgety. So I would say the AR's is better, easier to use, and just more precise overall. Of course, the AR has the bolt release here. The AK does not because it doesn't have one. Also, the AR has a drop-down trigger guard for use with winter gloves. The AK has a fixed trigger guard, but it's pretty ample, all things considered. And we could go on and on. So that kind of gives you my general things. Now, as far as production costs, that's really hard to know. The AK is designed for mass production in a factory. It's meant to be with loose tolerances, lots of hand fitting, mostly built by pretty much unskilled labor. The AR is the opposite. It's meant to be built in a highly technologically advanced factory, at least by 1960s standards, with relatively precision-made parts, but on the other hand, not near as much hand-fitting and all that goes into it. It's also easier to work on in the field. Rebarreling an AR is easy peasy, even with hand tools. With an AK, not so much. Typically, the attitude about the AK, if it breaks a major part, you just throw the gun in the scrap pile and scavenge it for parts. You know, if your top cover gets dented, that's easily replaced. But if your barrel gets bent or something wonky, usually it's just easier to throw it away. Whereas the AR, it's very easy to replace everything on this gun. So even though some might say the AK is more reliable and durable, the AR is easier to maintain and repair in the field, I would say. Of course, this is extreme generalization. We're still looking at the early generation AR. As far as AKs, different countries, different standards. But with that, let's move on kind of to the next generations. And there is one other big advantage to the AK. What if you need something more compact, smaller, more transportable, lighter? Well, there's a pro and a con here. Here are carbine versions, folding stock versions, whatever you'd like to say. This is the XM177E2. This is the AKMS. Now the AK was conceived to be built with a fixed and a folding stock from the very beginning. In fact, literally 2 out of the first 4 prototypes had folding stocks. The original AKS had a stock very much like the MP44, more of a sweep to it, and only locked on one side. But with the AKMS here, they went to more of a straight stock. It was stronger, it locked in on both sides, and was made out of stamped steel. Now this still had the 16¼ inch barrel, with the stock folded up, we're under 26 inches, not bad. And with it deployed, we're at about 35 inches. That's good. But this metal stock actually makes it a heavier gun. This thing is about, it's over 7.5 pounds, verging on 8. The reason I'm giving kind of loose figures, it depends what kind of furniture you have and other details like that. So it's not the lightest gun, but it is compact. With the AR system, we have a different story. When Colt purchased the whole design, they started marketing it as the AR15. Originally, this didn't refer to carbines, it referred to the family. They wanted to make this a modular family of guns. So they started offering carbines from the very get-go. The Colt 605, there was a 606 type gun. The first one that the military was interested in was the 607, but that was a kind of just a showcase model. The 609 and the 610 were the first ones to really go in. These would be the XM177, XM177E1. The 629 was the E2. Now they did go to a shorter gas system, carbine length we still use today. So we have a shorter sight radius. And at first it was a 10-inch barrel, but with the 1 in 12 twist and other factors, they ended up extending it out to 11.5 inches to give a full rotation. Well, nearly so. And to help control the rather wicked flash and sound of 223 out of this short of a barrel, they gave this giant moderator, which actually brought the overall length to about 15 inches anyway. So almost as long with the moderator as the AK. In the back, we have a sliding stock, a 2-positioner. Why not a folding stock? Well, as you know, the recoil system for the entire gun is back here. So at that time, they didn't really have a good way to install a true folding stock. So they went to a collapsing stock. This was a little under 33 inches with the stock out, and about 28, 29 inches with it collapsed in. So a little bit shorter, but also a little bit longer, depending on which way. But where this really did do well was the weight. This thing was only about 6 pounds, even lighter for some models. So did a lot better. The XM177 was used extensively in Vietnam, still usually with the 20-round mag, but they only had a few hundred, maybe a few thousand. The Air Force really liked them. They had the Gall 5 series. They weren't bought in the tens, hundreds of thousands, whereas the AKMS, well, yeah, of course it was. Just to flip them over, this is again my Polish build that I've had forever, and this is my Troy that I've had for a long time too. Very good, honest examples, rebuilds of what we had. But it is going to show you the carbine versions or the compact versions for special forces, paratroopers, what have you. Very important. Which is better? Do you need something smaller or lighter? Also, with the AKMS, you're not really sacrificing range or accuracy except for maybe comfort for your cheek. The XM177 with the short barrel, you are sacrificing a little bit for 223. However, I think sometimes the internet does kind of overstate it a bit. Personally, I like it more. The lightweight and just the cool factor. And it's as comfortable to shoot, in my opinion, as the full rifle, whereas the AKMS is a bit of a compromise. However, if you're a paratrooper, this is better. So this is more of a paratrooper operating in a tight vehicle gun. This is more of a special forces in the jungles and what have you gun. This moderator was a little doofy, though, and that's something we'll talk about in a bit. Colt would realize it. This is kind of where we're at. This is the AKAR world in the mid and late 60s. But, of course, things would progress very rapidly. So let's move kind of to the second generation of both. Both series would see many changes between 1966 and 1971. For the AR, of course, we go from the M16, M16E1 to the M16A1, which was type classified in 1967. Although some of the changes wouldn't be done until 1970, 1971. They did a lot of small things that added up to be great. It made it a lot more reliable. For example, they got rid of the Edgewater buffer. They went to a heavier buffer that worked better with the military ammunition. Just was all around better. They would improve the material that the furniture was made out of to make it more durable. They would, of course, have the forward assist appearing on the E1. Take it as you will. I think one thing we can agree was good. They would add these fencing to the lower. They would also add a pivot pin, a captive pivot pin to the front. The 20-round mag was still the standard. The Colt would first make a 30-rounder around 1969, but they really weren't available in numbers in Vietnam. So 20 was still very much the standard. Lots of little things, like going from the 3-prong to the birdcage flash hider. Still has the 20-inch barrel, all that stuff. The biggest thing internally, though, would be with the bore. It took a while to get chroming down for this 22 caliber bore. At first, they would introduce a chrome-plated chamber, which helped with extraction quite a bit. It wouldn't be until around 1970 that a fully chromed bore would come into use, and it took them a while to develop the technology to adequately and consistently chrome these on a mass production. Also, by this time, manufacturing had split off, not just from the Colt would keep making them, of course, but you had Hydromatic, GM, and eventually FN and others would join the lineup. So this is when the AR really starts to kind of come into its own, and by this point, it's a very solid, dependable gun. And 1969, 1970, most soldiers who actually served in the field, when surveyed, they were quite fond of it. Of course, they still had criticisms, but overall, yeah, they liked it. And so it was pretty widely accepted and would go on. In fact, it was so widely accepted, the Russians definitely took note here. I'm talking, of course, about the AK74. Is 5.45 by 39 a clone, a copy of 223, later known as 5.56, NATO? Yes, it is. By the mid-60s, some say even early 60s, the Soviets had samples of the M193 cartridge, and they were very intrigued with this new thing that America was trying out in a place called Vietnam. Just as 760 by 39 was kind of leading the way a couple of decades earlier, being an intermediate cartridge, what was this thing? Small diameter, high velocity. So the earliest samples were basically 223 bullets crammed into crimped down X39 cartridges. And they would play around with a few different loadings, trying different cores and stuff. They wanted tumbling and penetration. It was very much meant to be an anti-personnel round. By 66, they had a pretty good idea, and by 68, they almost had it nailed down and they started manufacturing. At the same time, in 66, they announced competition for a new rifle to fire it. And they did look at several concepts, including a balancing bolt system, things that wouldn't look that different from the later AN94. They looked at various things, but in the end, the design from the Kalashnikov team from Mishaco won out, much as the AKM had earlier, because it was about 50% the same parts, it was familiar, it was good enough. It was basically just a rebarreled AKM. Stamped receiver, wood furniture. They actually put these grooves in, some say just to make it easier to distinguish between AKM and AK74. Either way, they look cool. Same pistol grip, same handguards. In fact, if you look at a late AKM and an early AK74, a lot of the stuff is identical. They did go to the 90-degree gas block for shearing issues. Of course, they moved lugs and stuff. And probably one of the biggest changes is the new muzzle device on new 24mm threads. The Americans were using flash hiders, 3-prong or birdcage. Russians were doing muzzle brakes, either the slant type or this big honking thing, which also has a chamber back here, because they were concerned with recoil control. Otherwise, the only other major thing, of course, was the new magazine, made of synthetic polymer. This combined with the new 5.45 round did save quite a bit of weight in the kit. The gun itself weighs essentially the same, maybe just a little bit less on the barrel because it's thinner, but then again we add this up front, which does add about an extra inch to the overall length. But where the soldier was saving weight was on his mags and ammo, and these mags were really good. They didn't dent, of course, wasn't much to rust, and they were a cool color. Everything else is the same. Charging handle, sights. Yeah. So whereas the M16A1 had lots of little changes from the XM16E1, but with the same caliber, the AKM to the AK74 was kind of the flip. We changed calibers, which meant a new barrel, new bolt head, new magazine. Pretty much everything else stayed the same, at least within reason. But it worked for Russia. In 1973, the first kind of pre-production ones were ready. The design was done. And then finally, both the rifle and 7 and 6 cartridge were officially adopted in 1974 and first shown off to the world in 1977. So Russia was starting to field the AK-74 just in time for its own little Vietnam, as Rambo put it. Afghanistan, beginning in the latter part of 1979. By which point, America had, I kind of learned, no. But of course, things in the West were progressing as well. It's funny how they feed off of each other. Now that Russia has adopted 5.45, that does push the West more towards what would be soon known as 5.56 NATO. Because if the Russians liked it, America, you see what I'm saying? It's back and forth. So feature-wise, it's hard to compare. What you can say about the A1, yeah, it was more reliable. Oh, by the way, one of the last features to really appear was the storage compartment in the buttstock. That did not appear until the early 70s. And after that, the design was pretty well solidified for about 2 decades. But it took some time. And the AK-74 would go through several small changes between the mid-70s and mid-80s, but it was just to, streamline a few things. Also, when they were doing this, they took the opportunity to try to improve mass production, save on costs. This is when you start to see cast parts. For example, your gas block is cast, your front sight. Front trunnion is still machined, but the rear could be cast. Even the bolt carrier was cast, although the bolt was forged. And of course, both changes would occur for the AKM and the AK74. The AKM would cease production in Russia around 1977, but would serve for a lot longer. In foreign countries, yeah, even today they still make them. So the AK74 mostly replaced it, especially in Russia, but outside, yeah, different story. But that's for another video. Which is better? At this point, the AR is very mature, and the AK74 is quite new. But once they got up and running with the 74, since they based it on the AKM, it had relatively few teething problems. I don't know. They're both a lot of fun. They're both very good for what they are. The AK74 did address a few of the accuracy and range issues from the AKM. The new round had a little bit more range and accuracy, but the sights were still meh. And neither one would be issued with optics as a standard. The M16, of course, is still lighter weight, but is still a little bit longer. Yeah, I really don't know. They're both excellent guns, and the AK-74 proved itself quite lethal in Afghanistan. I can't pick. It's a draw for me at this point. I really like both. Both have a lot of classics going on. But just to appease you, I'll say the AK-74 so we can move on. We must also talk about carbines or folding stock models, because as you know, the AKS-74 was introduced very briefly after the original AK-74, and this was a small but incredibly intelligent update. We have a new left side folding stock that is just brilliant. Remember, the AKMS stock added weight. This thing, because it's lightweight hollow stamped steel, actually takes away weight. Now we're verging on 7 pounds, give or take. Now, also when it folds, it fits quite flush, meaning that it doesn't add a bunch of width to the gun in the bag. And the back is still nice and flush. We have an easy release catch. And while this might not be the best cheek weld in the world, it loads better. It's a smooth angle, rounded edge. Compared with the underfolder, it's brilliant. It's also a very sturdy, stable stock. In fact, the latch they use is kind of self-tightening, so as it wears in, it actually keeps itself quite tight. So it saves weight, makes it smaller, all around a brilliant stock. The rest of the AKS-74 was the same. So what about in America in the 70s and 80s? This one's just a representative. There was one major change with their carbines. You start to see with models like the 652. Remember I said they had the 11.5-inch barrel with that doofy moderator that made it about 15 inches. Well, because of legal changes and export stuff, Colt ended up getting rid of the moderator and just going to a standard bird cage and extending the barrel out to 14.5 inches. So it was about the same, 15-ish inches long. And by this, they actually kind of just accidentally stumbled upon an answer to everything. It gave better reliability. It could now mount a bayonet. It could still mount a grenade launcher. It gave a little bit better range and accuracy. It was just the right fit, and it didn't really add much more length or weight because, we got rid of the moderator. We replaced moderator length with barrel length. Well, these were exported to a lot of clients, including Israel. They were still sold in relatively small numbers to the U.S. military. It's a whole thing. You can read up about them. They're often called M16A1 or M16A2 carbines, depending on if it's a 1 in 12 or a 1 in 7 twist rate. And with that, let's talk about the 1980s in both countries here. The M16A2. Now, I recently did a video on this and more in depth, as did Small Arms Solutions, but not to harp. It's just I have to mention it here because in the late 70s, NATO was getting together and they wanted to kind of make 223 a standard. After trials, they would adopt the Belgian SS-109 round, becoming M855. 62 grain bullet, a little heavier. This required the fundamental change of going from the 1 in 12 to the 1 in 7 twist rate. Now they could have stopped there, but instead they adopted several other things. Some controversial, some others, yeah. They did go to a flash hider muzzle brake combo. They went to a heavier barrel, but only out front. They went to a new pattern of handguard, more durable and more universal because top and bottom are the same. They revised the rear sight. They went to a brass deflector to make it more lefty friendly. They reinforced the lower. They made a longer buttstock. And finally, now the 30 round mag is in common use. Not saying you can't find 20s, but finally we have this capacity. Well, what about the Russians here? Well, the obvious changes are with the magazine and the furniture. Referred to as plum by collectors. This was for both the folding and, of course, there was a fixed stock too. This was a new fiberglass reinforced. Well, it was a new polymerized thing. Later they would add more, and there's different mixtures. But it's lighter, durable, has a heat shield in the handguard. And of course, they would eventually get away from the AG4 magazines and go to these plum mags. Originally, this is kind of shiny. Later, they get more matte. The polymer was both easier to mass produce and lighter and more durable, easier to replace. So finally, in the 80s, they're getting away from wood. Although you can still find guns with wood on them. They also, around 1986, would introduce an improved version of 545x39, a new loading, basing it on experiences in Afghanistan, including operating in higher mountain environments, thinner atmospheres, that kind of thing. Other changes would be pretty minor. They would actually have a few different patterns of muzzle device, things like that. But really the change was with the furniture. And you did start to see rail mounts more often. Night vision became more common, although it was still not a standard. And of course, with the M16A2, they did experiment with making optics a standard, at least in the U.S. Army. But at that time, in the 80s, they decided against it. So this is what went into production. It's a little bit longer, just under 40 inches. It is heavier, verging on 8 pounds. Whereas the AK is actually losing weight. And of course, we have to mention the fire mode. Not really relevant to semi-auto enthusiasts like myself, but in the military, they replaced the full auto with a 3-round burst. Some do not like this, and I have to admit it does add complexity for very little gain. And of course, the thicker barrel adds weight for very little gain. And iron sights, a little more fidgety than needed. While I like some of the changes, like the handguard, yeah, some are kind of unnecessary, and it is heavier. It's a sexy looking rifle, though. But I have to say, if we're talking 85, 86, with the new furniture here, the new cartridge, I do think the AK74/AKS74 is looking pretty good compared to the M16A2. And, yeah, so, again, we're just talking personal preference. And, of course, the AK's ergonomics are the same as they've always been. No real improvements there. But at this point, it doesn't really matter that much. The AR still has better ergonomics. But, I don't know, the extra weight and length and not really having access to a lot of carbines. Yeah, I'm going to vote AK on this round. But, of course, we're not done yet. Before we move on, how's everyone doing? Hope everyone's having a good New Year's Eve, whenever you're watching this. Hope this is worthwhile. Try to think of something fun to do for this video. And who doesn't like a good old AK-AR comparison. With the 1990s, we do come to the end of the line, in some aspects. So, let's first talk about Russia and the AK74M. This was about to enter into production and service right as the Soviet Union fell apart. So, even though on paper it says 1991, in reality, these did not start appearing in any numbers really to the late 90s. 94 at the earliest, early 98, even 2000. In fact, the design was still being kind of finalized in the early 21st centuries. For example, adding the automatic latch for the top cover. Goes to show you. They have not declared the original AK-74, AKS-74 obsolete yet, but as old ones wear out and they need new guns, they pick up AK-74Ms. What this is, in principle, is to replace all previous versions. In the past, you had the AK-74 fixed stock, AKS-74 folder, plus you had several versions with rail mounts. They wanted to quit doing that and just have a one-size-fits-all. So the front end is pretty much like S74. We have still further updated now this black fiberglass polyamide furniture. And we have a new side folding stock. Now this is a solid body stock meant to mimic the look of a fixed stock, but it's on the same type of hinge as the AKS-74, although they did increase the diameter to 5.5 millimeters. And now the side rail is a standard feature. It even stores a cleaning kit in the stock. Huzzah. So rail standard, folding stock standard, and they made several improvements to both durability and production efficiency. For example, they went to a heavier top cover. Pretty much everything on AK-74M type is different in the small details. I've done videos in the past talking about how individually they don't seem like big things, but put together they do equal a whole new gun. Not too dissimilar from the differences from the original M16 to the M16A1. A little bit adds up. So this was to replace a lot of different guns in service. And of course, the Russian version still fires 5.45 by 39. These have been fielded in great numbers in the 21st century and still are the standard today, although they are starting to be replaced, at least in some Special Forces units. In the U.S., the M16A4 is really the last rifle variant that started with the original AR15. 20-inch barrel, nearly 40 inches long, and now we are heavy. Not even counting the accessories, we're nearly 9 pounds. If you count everything that gets put on an A4, it's a 10-pound gun easily. From the factory, the major difference between the A2 and the A4 is that the A4 has a 1913 rail, a Picatinny rail on the top. They can come with a removable carry handle, although later ones usually don't. Same buttstock. They can have the plastic handguard, or they can have the newer modular handguard system. Still has the 1-in-7 twist. Same muzzle device. Bipods and foregrips are standard. Colt kind of patterned this in 1997, and it was soon introduced and primarily adopted by the Marine Corps. This was the ultimate culmination of the AR15 in terms of being almost a DMR, a long-range precision gun. This is about as far as they could push it. But of course, it comes at the cost of length and weight and everything else. Nevertheless, for decades, the Marines and others were happy with it. In fact, these only were retired in the last handful of years. And they were made by both Colt and FN. So yeah, we saw the SP1, which represents the early. This is where it ends. Not a lot of differences. They still had the 3-round burst. Now we do have an ambi selector, standard mags, not a lot of differences. And again, this is kind of where the two AK lines that started off separate, the AK and the AKS back in the 40s, come together, where a folding stock is standard. I should add that the AK74M is heavier than previous models. We're verging back on 8 pounds. Part of it is the scope rail being standard, part of it is the stock is heavier. It's not a pig, I guess maybe 7.5 pounds is more accurate. But the polymer mag cell. But because it is a one-size-fits-all, and it does have a reinforced top cover, a little bit thicker trunnion, all that makes it a little heavier. So that's kind of what's going on in the late 90s. Which one do I like better? Obviously the AK74M. I can't target shoot. This really is an excellent folding stock. The M16A4 is a great rifle. In fact, it's exceedingly reliable. At this point, the bugs are long worked out, and it's just about as reliable as anything. But my God, the issue guns are just so heavy, unless you need everything. Yeah. I do like it, though. It's a great gun. It's just heavy. So, what about the other side of the story before we wrap things up? Sometimes the biggest successes in history are accidents. The M4. You know, originally the AK was adopted, at least by many nations, as a submachine gun replacement. They expected the SKS to be the rifle. Or, you know, the US expected the M14 to last, and the M16 kind of came out of nowhere. The M4 was kind of the same vein. It started off as a PDW, a replacement for the, well, M1, M2, M3 carbines, finally to be used as a personal defense gun, secondary special forces gun. It was not meant to be general issue. It was adopted in 1994 and would go through several changes early on. One of the earliest was adding the removable carry handle to Picatinny rail. Another was the switch from the late Car15 stock to this M4 type stock with 2 sling points, also going from 2 position to 4 to make it more adjustable. Still had the 3-round burst originally. Still used the same old carbine length gas system we've always had. And it had that 14-inch barrel. Sorry, singing the way. But they did beef it up, making it heavier out front, like the M16A2, still skinny into the handguards. And they did go to an, well, I should say not ambidextrous, but reversible sling mount on the front here. It basically was an M16A2 carbine, but it was just coming into widespread use 1999, 2000, when the War on Terror happened. And so ended up being acquired in large numbers. Now early on, they did have some issues. Range, reliability, and overheating. But it would grow into its own. And of course, along at the same time, the AK74M is starting to see widespread use in Russia. The M4 has pretty much all of the advantages and disadvantages. Nothing has fundamentally changed. The 4-position stock is kind of nice. It's not a pig, it's not super heavy, but we do have the heavier barrel and everything. We do have the ovular handguards, which are a little bit better at heat dissipation. And like the M16A4, this does have a good way to mount an optic. The AK does too, the side mount, but the 1913 is certainly a more modern style. So, yeah, it's a good gun, but it was being kind of pressed beyond what it was originally meant to do. So when it did overheat, you can't really blame it. Plus it still has that silly 3-round burst. The AK over here is still the standard selector as usual. But they are modernized versions of the old designs. And the M4 would end up replacing not just the M16, but several other guns besides. All the old machine guns, submachine guns, even a lot of Beretta M9 pistols. So in both cases, they were able to replace several guns with, one basic spec thing. And then we move in to the 21st century. Here are pretty much the two most modern guns I have for the US military and the Russian military. Of course, I wish I had an AK-12, even an AK-15, but we know how that goes. And to be fair, those are quite new to service. It's mostly AK-74Ms. However, Russia, of course, had the AKS-74U, the Krink, in its short 8 1/4 inch barrel. It was a submachine gun in every conceivable way except for its caliber. They liked it, but it had major issues, and they saw developments in the USA with the M16 carbine and AK developments in other nations. Long story short, one thing they did after the fall of the USSR and the Russian Federation, Izhevsk was rebranded as Izhmash and started trying to court customers, be they the Russian military or export. So they released the AK Century series, the AK100 series. Now the AK74 is part of that, AK74M to be exact. It's a full-size 16-inch 5.45 rifle. The AK101 is a 16-inch rifle, the same, but it's in 5.56 NATO for export. The AK103 is the same, 16-inch rifle, but it's in the classic 7.62x39 because a lot of customers still preferred that. The AK102 is a carbine, chambered for 5.56. The AK104 is a carbine, chambered for 7.62x39. And the AK105 is a carbine, chambered for 5.45x39. Now this is, of course, my Arsenal 106, so it's in 5.56, but it can stand in because the Russian military has purchased the AK105 in some numbers to be used as, well, a carbine. And this combines the features of the AKS-74U and the standard AK-74M. It has the same standard length gas system, takes the same furniture, the back end's all the same folding solid body stock. The difference is up front. We have a combination front sight gas block, and then we have an intermediate 12.5-inch barrel. So a little bit shorter than M4, but close. And then on the end of it, this is the extended Bulgarian flash hider, but typically it would have a conical device with expansion chamber for reliability, and that also doubles as a flash hider. So overall length with that device is still a little bit shorter than an M4 barrel, but not by a whole lot. And they found that this is a good intermediate, so they use both 12-inch and 16-inch versions, carbine and rifle. And that let them replace the older Krinkovs, as we call them. And the whole series has been really interesting. Of course, they progressed it further, the AK-107, 108, and as I mentioned, the AK-12, which is the truly modernized version with rails and all that fun stuff. And lots of people will add Zenitco furniture to their guns. But, yeah. That said, the AK starting to little show its age. I mean, the furniture is modern, the magazines are modern. They can even give it modern muzzle devices, but we still have the same basic AK safety selector, no automatic last round hold open. Optics mounting, no matter how you do it, is a bit awkward. I seem to think that FB Radom hit on the right call with the barrel, but it has the side mount, which is okay, but yeah, it's not as integrated as later guns. Its ergonomics are from the 1940s, including trigger. But of course, you can produce these in large numbers for a less than highly professional army if needed. Whereas the M4 has evolved into the M4A1. We still have the heavy barrel up front. Now we have a heavy barrel under the handguard too, which makes a lot more sense. We also have the rail system with different devices. We have lots of different muzzle devices. This is the Surefire. Carry handles are now gone. We see optics. We can have the standard stock, or you start to see different ones now. Polymer magazines are starting to be a very common thing, typically Magpul. And probably best of all, and this is what makes an M4A1 an M4A1, they've gotten rid of the 3-round burst and gone back to the more popular full auto, which is also simpler. There's pros and cons, but with this heavier barrel and the heavier buffer back here, it handles full auto quite well. It was really with these M4A1 updates that kind of kept the AR from being replaced in American military service. They were able to make it good enough to keep on, much like how the AKM and AK74 kept on in Russia. No reason to go to an entirely new system with a whole new supply and logistic chain if you can just make a few changes to your existing gun. And whereas the AK's ergonomics are starting to show their age, the AR-15s are holding up surprisingly well. It's not the most lefty-friendly gun out there, but it's manageable. Bolt hold open and a well-done safety now that it's ambidextrous too. A nicely placed magazine release. It has aged gracefully, I would say. Yeah, it's gotten heavier again as a carbine. We're, depending on how you accessorize it, bumping 8 pounds, certainly over 7 again. But then again, the AK is put on, basically both platforms put on weight after the Cold War. I think they get out of their fighting trim and kind of let themselves go to seed a bit. But it's just the nature of combat. Both the AK74M, AK105, and the M4A1, they were evolved to meet the needs of the wars that the two countries were facing. Obviously, America first in Afghanistan and Iraq, and then, of course, Russia had all the activity in Syria and elsewhere, and Ukraine and Crimea, yada yada. These are what they feel they need for modern standards. So I do think that if we're just talking the AKs that I have access to, the traditional AKs, and not necessarily the AK10, the AK12, even it I think is a little dated, frankly. But I do think the AR today, which is typically in the form of the M4A1, is the better gun. So there you have it. In this last kind of generation, I think the AR system, as it is, has the upper hand. It's accessible for either handed shooter. It's easy to put accessories on. It's optics friendly. It's reliable. We do have newer loadings of the cartridge. And even Russia, of course, has accepted. Basically, you need multiple cartridges. There's never going to be a one-size-fits-all cartridge. And I think the guys who designed the AR-15 knew that way back when. Other countries needed more time to learn. So there we have it. What do you think? Which one and which era do you think is better? Okay, got through. If you're a little tired, imagine me. But you know what? Happy to do it if people enjoy it, and I pretty much assume people will watch this in parts. Maybe on New Year's Day, less than 100%, or maybe not. Who knows? But I do appreciate you hanging out. I do appreciate you tuning in for these Patreon awareness videos as we move into 2022. We'll just have to see what happens. Maybe this new year will have as many positive surprises as the last year had not positive ones. I don't know. At any rate, I do find it interesting to compare guns, AR and AK. Of course, I'm not going to be comparing accuracy, ballistics, torture tests. I think of them more in a historical point of view, because they were the two guns going up against each other across the Berlin Wall, across the Middle East, in the jungles of Vietnam, everywhere. and potentially across World War III. That, thank God, never happened, but could have done. They didn't know in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And it's interesting to see the AR mature from the original M16 and the earliest carbines through the modern guns. And it's interesting for the AK. In a lot of ways, the AKM was what the Russians had envisioned in the 1940s. They just didn't have quite the technology and the industrial setup to do on the scale they needed. It's really hard to estimate cost of an AK because so much is involved in the setup. Individual unit cost is cheap, but setup is quite expensive. Plus, in a command economy like Soviet Russia, the numbers are whatever the hell they say they are. They make numbers up. And communists, that's one thing you learn if you study that era in history, is you cannot trust the numbers. I don't care what they are, because they're made up. It is interesting how they had different attitudes towards folding stocks and barrel lengths, and how kind of one would copy the other, and back and forth, because, you know, when someone else has a good idea, go for it. I think 545 by 39 is the better cartridge for the AK, while 556 is a better cartridge for the AR, because they were both kind of, well, the AR was designed for it, and the AK was well enough adapted. It works. Although I will say in recent years, newer 556 AKs like the M90 and the Beryl have changed my mind. I'm willing to change sometimes. I'm not quite that old yet. So what do you think? Give me your opinion. I'd love to chat with you in the comments below. Again, I greatly appreciate all the support. And we'll try to be a little more interesting and dynamic now that the holiday season's ending. With that, this is Misha, wishing you a happy new year, and we'll catch you very soon next time.